So for the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at this Old Testament book of Job. And if you've missed it, the story so far is that Job had a blessed life with family, with wealth, with health. But then in a horrible turn of events, almost, in the blink of an eye, all of that was taken away. He lost his wealth, he lost his animal stocks, and all his kids died in a horrible accident. And yet, so bad that his wife actually said to him, look, you need to curse God and die. But he didn't turn away from God. He clung to God during that difficult time. Then Job's 3 friends came to visit, and that's what we looked at last week, and had long conversations about why this suffering was happening to God. To Job. And to sum it up, I've got it in there in that yellow on the screen. They were basically saying the way that God's work is that good things happen to good people, to those who honour God, and bad things happen to people who aren't honouring God. And therefore, if bad things are happening to Job, then, well, you must have done something wrong. But this was the issue. Job had not done anything wrong. And so he was trying to suggest that it makes no sense why he is suffering. That Old Testament theology of blessings go to those who honour God and suffering goes to those who don't wasn't applicable to Job. And so we skip forward a little bit from last week and we're now up to chapter 29, where the 3 friends have finished speaking and Job gives his final defence, his final statement, trying to explain where he's coming from. And basically he said these things. I wish that I could go back to the way they were, but I can't. Often we feel that way, isn't it? When things just change and we're struggling or suffering, we just want to go back to the way it was. But it doesn't work that way. He goes on to say, my life ebbs away. God has forgotten me. I cry out to God, but God doesn't answer. If I had done something wrong, then all this makes sense. But he goes, but I haven't done anything wrong. Then he finishes his defence, his statement that goes for a couple of chapters, with the line, let the Almighty answer me. So that's where it finishes. Let the Almighty answer me. But we have to wait for God's answer a little bit because another person turns up, a 4th person called Elihu, who is a 4th friend who is younger than the others. And he says that he hasn't spoken yet because the others are older, so he let them speak first. But now he can't hold his tongue. And he starts to speak. And Elihu starts with some good wisdom. He says things like, that we need to be careful what we say and we need to be careful not to put words into God's mouth. And God is not evil, therefore God can't do bad things. But his best comment, I thought, was his response to Job saying, God answer me, or that God isn't answering. He says that maybe God always is speaking, we're just not listening properly, or we're not listening in the right places, or we're not picking up what God is saying. So I think, he's actually got some good wisdom. This younger person's joined the conversation and has inputted some really good ideas. But he ends up saying the exact same conclusion as the other 3 friends. That basically, he says that people who obey and serve God live out their days in prosperity, but if they do not listen to God, they suffer and perish. That was his quote exactly. Therefore, he goes on to say, your case is with God, Job. Stop the questions because you obviously have done something to deserve this. But this is what Job keeps on saying. This doesn't apply to him. This is Job's issue. I tried to draw a picture here to make sense of what Job is trying to say. He says, okay, right, sometimes you can say that if people make poor decisions or sin or make sinful decisions, that leads to suffering. He says, yes, you can do that. But you can't backwards engineer this. He said if you turn it around, it doesn't always apply. Just because somebody is suffering does not mean that they have made a poor decision or have sinned against God. Does that sort of make sense? Yes, you can say it's true going one way, but if you flip it around and try to reverse engineer it, Job's saying it doesn't always work that way. And actually, last week in my sermon, I was suggesting this idea that in life stuff just happens, that more often than not, suffering is just the world we live in, not as a result of poor or sinful decisions. So Job finishes his defense, his statement with that line, "Let the Almighty answer me." And we get to our Bible reading that Marion read out for us today. And in the first verse, God did answer. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm." So are you ready for this? This is God's answer to all the questions that Job has been asking for 37 chapters. God responds. But in a reminder that God Almighty is one and the same as Jesus, God doesn't actually answer the question directly, but rather answers Job's question with a question, which is exactly what Jesus did all the time during his earthly life. Actually, he didn't answer a question with a question, he answers a question with 60 questions. God just speaks for 2.5 chapters of question after question after question to Job. Questions like, where were you when ... or have you ever ... or can you ... or do you ... These questions just keep flowing and flowing, question after question. God quizzes Job about the complexities of the world, the universe, the creation, the vastness of space, the stars and constellations, the weather systems, the animal life, behavior, food and resources, seasons and the rhythms of life. God asked Job, do you understand all these things? Can you make all these things happen? I encourage you, if you have time, which lots of us have time at the moment, to actually read these 2.5 chapters of God's response. It's quite relentless. As one preacher that I was reading this week said, after each question, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear Job's whisper, I think I'll take a pass on that question. See, if Job can't answer one of the 60 questions that God asked, there is no way that he can answer the 60 billion other extravagant intricacies involved in sustaining the universe. And so in chapter 40, verse 1, God actually takes a breath in all these questions and asks Job if he's got a reply. This is Job's first reply. Oh, I've already got it there. It says, I am unworthy. How can I reply? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, I'll say no more. Job is already going, no, I'm not even going to try. I'm going to put my hand over my mouth. I'm not going to answer. But God is not finished yet and keeps going with these questions. About another 1.5 chapters of questions, this time covering the complexities of justice and includes the mythical creatures of the behemoth and the leviathan. At the end of all this, God pauses again. We're not quite sure if God's ready to keep going for a third time, but Job this time doesn't even wait. Job jumps in straight away. And at the beginning of chapter 42, this is what Job says in his second reply. He says, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely, Job says, I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So that's where we're going to pause the story for today, but what do we make of this? What do we make of this? If I could summarize it, I've put this picture together. It's almost like Job asked the questions, God, why am I suffering? And then God just bombards Job with question after question after question after question after question. And in the end, Job says, you're right, God, I don't understand, and I'm sorry. But did God actually answer Job's question? Did God, it seems like, Job is genuinely trying to ask God, why is this happening? That the Old Testament theology of blessings go to those who honour God and suffering goes to those who don't isn't applying here. And he's genuinely asking God, why? Why is this happening? And instead, God doesn't answer the question, but talks about the complexities of life and almost, I don't want to use this word because I don't want to put ideas of trying to understand God. But I wrote in my sermon that he almost shames Job into not asking questions anymore. So how do we understand all of this? I'm really interested to know what you think. And if you want to write in the comments section your ideas of how do you understand all of this. I'm laughing because I see Bill correcting my pronunciation of Leviathan. I probably still can't say that right, Bill. But yeah, this is a tough one to understand. What do we make of all this? Look, I read a lot of sermons and articles on this, and I've thought about this a lot. How do we understand God's response to Job? And I'm going to give you 3 different perspectives. Some of these are out of the sermons that I read, and one of them is actually some of my own thinking of ways that people have tried to understand God's response to Job. So here's the first perspective: the complexities of life and suffering. And in a sentence, I could sum up this perspective in saying, our human thinking is not able to understand the complexities of the life and the universe, and that includes the complexities of why people suffer. This perspective is found in Job's response in chapter 42, verse 3, when he says, "Surely I spoke of things I don't understand, things too wonderful for me to know." Job admits, after all God's question, he admits he does not understand how the universe works. He can't count the clouds in the sky or understand how animals were created or comprehend the power of the behemoth. Even with unlimited time and teaching, Job is admitting, I don't think I could ever understand this. This is beyond my capacity to understand. Therefore, this perspective suggests it's the same with the complexities of suffering, that we'll never completely understand why people suffer. One preacher I was reading used a nice analogy of travelling, or when we used to travel, to a place that's got a completely different culture to our own. And it's like, even with the best intentions, sometimes you're not getting what's happening around you because it's so different to your own culture. And he went on to say that maybe we just have to trust the travel guide in guiding us through that because we just don't understand. And maybe it's the same with God. We'll never understand the bad things that happen, and especially when bad things happen to good people. But we trust that God is working for the good of those who love him. The second perspective is similar, but sort of like the other side of that coin. And in a sentence, God is God and we are not, and so we just have to trust God. God knows what God is doing. So this picks up on the sovereignty of God. And when it comes to sermons on these chapters of God's response, this is by far the most common the common way of understanding it. The 60 questions highlight that it is God who created all things. It is God who is in all things and understands all things and sustains all things. In other words, God is the one in control. God is sovereign. And where the first perspective focuses on the complexity of life and suffering and our lack of understanding, as I said, this perspective was almost the other side of the coin, that God is actually able to understand the complexities of life and suffering, and God is in control. And we just have to trust God. The issue is that neither of those first two perspectives give a satisfying answer to Job's question, but rather simply invites us to trust in the goodness of God. I've got a third perspective that's arisen from some of my thinking, and whilst I'm not suggesting this is perfect either, I don't think it gives a satisfying answer either. It's just another perspective that might be helpful to you. So this perspective is, in a sense, there's a beauty or a mystery in the balance between blessings and suffering. Or in a sentence, a time of suffering can help us to see and be thankful for the times of blessings in our lives. I remember a youth group discussion a number of years ago that I was leading about why bad things happen to good people. And one of the young people said in this youth group, he said, "But if nothing bad ever happened to us, how would we be able to recognise the good stuff? It would all just be stuff," he said. I thought it was a profound statement by a high schooler. There is this beauty in the balance between good and bad, or blessings and suffering. You know, he's right. If everybody's life was blessings, would we even know what blessings were? Or do we only know that we are blessed because we've experienced times of suffering? It's in the comparison between the two that we actually find perspective. As I said, it doesn't necessarily give an answer to the question of suffering, but it might give us into some insight into why God doesn't stop all suffering in the world. Just as we need mosquitoes and snakes and spiders in the ecosystem, maybe there's a mysterious place for suffering in the complex scheme of life. As I said, none of these answers actually give us a very satisfying answer to Job's question. But maybe that's the point. Maybe when it comes to suffering, there is no simple, complete answer. Look, I don't actually think Job is being kind to himself when he says at the end, I'm repentant, I'm sorry, and despise myself. I don't think it was bad that he asked God the question. I think it's good that he asked God the question, or to engage God in this whole issue of why am I suffering. Job didn't do anything wrong by asking the question. Actually, I think it's in the midst of the suffering he ended up into a point of ultimately trusting God more because of the questions he was asking. And maybe that's what we can take away from today's passage. It's okay to be frustrated when we're suffering, and even to cry out to God why, but we need to be prepared that there's no simple, complete answer. But rather it's a mixture of embracing the complexity and the mystery of suffering and trusting in the sovereignty of God. And as we see in my final sermon next week, there is an endpoint to suffering. There's a promise that the suffering will not last forever and there will be a time of restoration. But that's next week. We'll leave it there for now.